Canada's corruption and money laundering problems are getting worse, and it feels as though the government is not only enabling these things happening, they are encouraging it to happen so that they can fake pad the stats of their GDP and pretend like everything's fine. And I hurt my back in the gym today, so I'm extra mad about it because when I saw this new information that came out, I got so angry at some of the stuff we've been covering, watching what the grocery cartel is up to and how they are cracking down on their competition, and then seeing from an economist on Bloomberg how so much of the money laundering is getting attributed to that GDP was wild to see. It is staggering. Let's get into today's video.
Canada's Competition Bureau has launched investigations into the parent companies of grocery giants Loblaw and Sobeys over alleged anti-competitive conduct. The commissioner launched the probes in March, saying at the time that there is reason to believe that the firm's use of so-called property controls limits competition in the retail grocery sector. Sobeys owner Empire called the inquiry unlawful. Canada's major grocery chains have come under increasing scrutiny.
They're using regular process to investigate allegations. I don't see how that could be unlawful, but coincidentally, the grocery cartel doesn't like it.
As consumers struggle with rising food prices. All right, let's bring in Sylvain Charlebois, Senior Director at the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. Sylvain, welcome. Thank you for being here. Now, the Commissioner of Competition launched a probe saying there's reason to believe the company's use of property controls limits retail competition. Can you explain this? How do these property controls work?
Well, what is alleged here is that grocers would actually limit the kinds of food sold in a strip mall, for example. So if the major tenant is, say, Sobeys or Loblaw, they would make sure that other stores won't be selling similar products. That's one way to do it. Also, what is also alleged is that some grocers, Loblaw and Sobeys, would actually buy land, making sure that the competition doesn't build there. Or if they actually mouthball a store, they just leave it there, making sure that no one else actually takes over that building. So
that was one of the things that I found particularly crazy. Again, it's allegations, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. But the allegations are, they're saying, no, you can't have anybody around us who sells the same products. Then they get to sign that contract with the landlord. That's not the big crazy thing. I get it. Anti-competition, blah, blah, blah. Sucks, but I could see why they'd be motivated to do that. To buy land and then just sit on that land specifically so that you don't get competition is wild. We're always thinking about price fixing and that type of anti-competition. These guys are literally shutting down competitors from even being able to open at all. So that is a level of corruption that, again, allegations that I was not prepared for, that they're buying land so that people can't buy it and build on top of their contracts of, oh, we want all these non-competes in here.
You're basically suppressing competition at retail, and location at retail is so critical, especially when it comes to food retail.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, grocery stores are already facing public backlash on high prices. How does this reflect on the big three chains?
Listen, first of all, I'm not surprised of the accusation. I think for people who have been following the industry, and I've been following the industry for 25 years, this is something that has been going on for a very long time. And of course, even it's been happening for a very long time, it doesn't mean that it's right. It doesn't mean that the Canadians are actually willing to accept it, at least not anymore, given what's been happening with food prices and food security in this country. You just heard this week from Food Banks Canada a devastating report telling Canadians that our food security situation is getting worse. So,
yeah, like you said, grocery location is what's important. And this guy made such a good point, because when we have international competitors that try to come in, they are the ones who are saying, oh, it's so hard to launch in Canada and crack that market. And that's because they're literally being boxed out from these other local competitors who are just saying like, yeah, no, you can't get to these prime locations. And people are going to drive way out of their way to go to a new grocery store they haven't heard of.
So obviously you want to make access not an issue, but of course, when you try to control geography, as a retailer, well, and you're suppressing competition, access to food, affordable food, becomes an issue for a lot of people. And I'm thinking mainly about smaller towns, smaller villages where there's basically only one option left.
This is also interesting. What outcome do you anticipate from this probe?
It's hard to tell. So first of all, we need to recognize that the Competition Bureau, with this investigation, which started on March 1st, finally recognizes that it has a job to do.
Finally, the government is investigating a potential, fraud and corruption case. Finally.
It needs to look into issues like this one, and I think it's an important issue to look into. Two, the public needs to be reassured. I mean, a lot of people out there feel unprotected, and the Competition Bureau has a role to play. The bread price fixing scandal investigation has been going on for 9 years, still hasn't been resolved completely. So that's the kind of reputation that the Bureau has. So it's nice to hear that the Bureau will start to become a little bit more proactive with these issues.
Yeah, I think that's really important to see and let these companies know, hey, there is a potential that you could be investigated. I don't think they're going to care. I don't think that this is going to stop what they're currently doing personally, because let's get into this next video where we get to learn about how large of an impact all this fraud of the international fraud and money laundering that's happening in Canada is having to our GDP. Because if we eliminated that alleged number, whoo, Canada's GDP would not be looking good.
That has been playing out these last few weeks, also raising an important discussion on the mechanics of financial crime in Canada and what is attracting illicit activity to Canadian institutions. For a look at how we got here, I want to bring in Christian Loprete, professor at the Royal Military College and Queen's University, a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and co-editor of Dirty Money, Financial Crime in Canada. Thanks very much for joining us. How would you characterize the scale of financial crime that is currently taking place in Canada?
Well, look, at an estimated $113 billion annually, that's a pretty substantial portion of relative to Canada's GDP. By all accounts, the issue is getting worse, not better, in part because the bad actors have figured out that in this country we have relatively limited capacity to deter, to enforce, to detect global illicit financial flows. And it drives everything from the cost of living, estimated to have increased real estate prices by 8% based on the Cullen Commission on Money Laundering British Columbia's findings, to the fentanyl crisis in the streets. And of course, fentanyl was a major part of what TD is currently facing its investigation for.
Now,
so we did cover a little bit of that TD investigation, obviously the allegations they were dealing with. But the crazier thing is, so that alleged 113 billion with a B, billion, is 5.4, roughly 5.4% of Canada's GDP. In just money laundering and fraud, 5.4%, which means if you eliminated that, our GDP per capita is already plummeting. It is so low. It is falling every year, and it looks like it's trending to continue to keep falling now. And that is with an additional 113 billion in fraud and money laundering. How bad is our country actually doing?
Just to be clear, the investigations in the U.S. are related to a Canadian bank, but you've done a lot of work on what's happening within our own borders here in Canada. I mean, how have we gotten to this point? You alluded to it a little bit, but the things that would perhaps make Canada a preferred destination for money laundering.
So really, this goes back to the 1980s and 1990s. A lot of it has its roots in the Pacific expansion strategy in the 1990s and the Chrétien government, where we opened up to financial flows from the Asia Pacific. But
it's always the French guys.
With relatively few controls on those flows and with relatively limited capacity. In Canada, we didn't even have a financial intelligence unit at the time, and the Integrated Proceeds of Crime team in the RCMP was subsequently effectively disbanded and neutered. And so the government did set up a financial intelligence unit, but FinTrack, unlike any of its cognate institutions in other allied and partner countries, is set up effectively as an administrative agency rather than an enforcement agency. So its enforcement powers are very small and very weak. We can see this with the latest fine, for instance, against RBC, which amounts to 49% of the CEO's annual bonus that year. This is obviously not a major deterrent for Canadian banks to try to improve their business practices when it comes to transnational, global financial and economic crime.
Well, since you laid out the situation here in Canada, how might you compare oversight here with the system set up in countries such as the US or Australia?
Well, so look at the size of the fines. Here we have in the millions of dollars. In Australia, Combank was fined 700 million Australian dollars. Westpac was fined 1.4 billion. The two large casino companies were each fined 450 million. And in the US, fines regularly range.
Yeah, and I think if we were talking about it in one of the other videos last week, I think the max fines that we have on a lot of our crimes here are like 500,000 per infraction. And so, you know, we were looking at it, and it's like, oh, even if they can find 10 infractions that they're going to track these all down and do that, it's like it's pennies on the dollar compared to billions or 700 million.
In over $1 billion. So you can see just the scales are just completely different. Plus in the US, this is something a lot of people don't talk about. Once you get a fine, you also face significant regulatory oversight, auditing, reporting, and the like as a financial institution. So it imposes significant immediate financial cost in terms of the fine. It imposes ongoing business costs in terms of the added regulatory burden, and it of course imposes reputational costs, none of which there has been political will in Canada to impose on financial institutions here. And you can bet that if it's happening with TD in Canada, it is happening among all the major banks.
Yeah, and again, to put that in perspective, we have more CRA agents per capita than the US by, I think, more than double. I'd have to double check my numbers. We for sure have more, but I believe we have more than double per capita. It might be 3 times as much. Again, I want to check the numbers before I give the official one. But the point is, those are all CRA members who are investigating individuals and small business. So you've probably heard your neighbor, your uncle, yourself, who's been audited by the CRA, and then all these big corporations with all this corruption keep getting away with it. But, oh, you know, goodness gracious, you didn't claim an e-transfer. You're going to get smoked by the CRA because they got all these people doing personal tax audits.
With TD in the United States, it's happening among all the major banks in Canada.
Well, one thing we hear about in Ottawa is a desire to attract foreign investment to the country, and certainly a lot of business leaders have views on how successful Canada has been on that front. But on a subject like this, where does the federal government come in, and what are the implications for attracting foreign investment just based on our track record on a subject like this?
So this is a great question, and this is partially, I think, why the government talks a good talk about doing more on financial crime, but actually has done relatively little, although it has, of course, moved on beneficial ownership, and it did make changes to some of the crypto and virtual asset reporting requirements, but that was largely.
They keep blaming crypto, and obviously some capacity of crypto is going to be used for money laundering. But the #1 currency used for money laundering and corruption and fraud and illegal activity all across the world is USD. Conveniently left out of the conversation.
Largely out of political interest during the convoy, but it shows that within a month you can get major change. The challenge for the government is that we live in a globally competitive environment, and so if you increase oversight, you increase detection, enforcement, penalties, and the like, it makes Canada less competitive for foreign direct investment and other financial flows into the country. And of course, under a circumstance where the Canadian economy is already struggling, where on a per capita basis, Canadians feel and arguably are worse off today than they were 10 years ago when the government came to power. There's sort of a sense that perhaps the government doesn't want to impose additional constraints on the Canadian economy that might further impede economic growth in this country. And of course, the financial industry is one of the two outsized industries that drive Canadian GDP. So imposing greater regulation would necessarily have an impact on GDP growth.
That's actually a pretty bold claim from this economist. He's obviously, speculating. These are allegations. But what he's essentially saying is the government is pretty aware of the corruption. And maybe I shouldn't put words in his mouth. But I interpreted it as the government is aware that we have a money laundering problem. They are aware that we have a fraud problem and a corruption problem, but they are just enabling it because we are doing so poorly. Canadians are way worse off than they were 10 years ago. So they're going, ignore it. We could really use that 5.5% of our GDP in fraud. We need it. We can't crack down on the financials.
And just a final question, because, people get really excited about cryptocurrencies, but when it comes to the mechanics of modern day financial crime, how does crypto, even the blockchain, fit into the bigger picture?
Yeah, so again, I think that's a really important question because financial crime, we've really seen with the globalization of financial crime, that's been supercharged by the advent of virtual assets and cryptocurrency. We've really seen the professionalization of money laundering, where we now have the professions among law firms, among accounting firms, among real estate agents, all of which were called out by the Crown Commission for their complicity here and their unwillingness to take their own professionals and hold them to account.
I am a real estate agent in London, Ontario. Reach out to me in the link below if you want to work with me and my team all the way across Canada. The reason I'm stopping there to bring that up is because there is no capacity right now, essentially, in which you can buy a house in Bitcoin. It is so unbelievably hard to buy a house in Bitcoin. So to say that, it's Bitcoin that's the trouble and that's what's facilitating all these things, like talking about working with real estate agents, on every transaction I've done, I've never seen somebody buy a house with Bitcoin. I've seen people sell Bitcoin, have cash, which is a taxable event that is tracked by the government because now you have all that money put into your accounts, then sent to the lawyers. It is really, really hard to actually get cash to the lawyers without some level of tracking happening, especially through FinTrack and down payments and all those things, where it's an illegal crypto purchase. So I don't know. I don't know how much that's impacting. Not that I need to go to bat for realtors and Bitcoin because they have their own problems, obviously. But I just don't. I've never seen it. And I'm somebody who's in the Bitcoin space and in the real estate space. And I'm not seeing people buy houses in Bitcoin.
For engaging and enabling and abetting illicit behavior. And this makes it difficult inherently also for the banks. So we do have to cut them some slack because these professional money launderers make these transactions look perfectly normal often within any one sovereign jurisdiction. And you need to see the global picture and global flows to understand that these transactions are problematic. But of course, when you're dealing with cartel money, the US regulator FinCEN is arguing that TD should have had the ability to pay better attention and closer attention, should have been able to detect that. And that's, of course, important for Canadian banks because we now have 3 Mexican cartels that are active in Canada. And as a result, Canada is the largest fentanyl exporter to Australia. And
I have heard that the cartel presence is growing in Canada, and I'm not surprised when our government is clearly so weak on crime. Don't forget to get your Axe to the Tax merch. It is in the link below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Do not forget to like and subscribe. I appreciate you guys for being here, and have a great rest of your day.